Chapter 8. The Mask Slips. The inspector considered this. It's possible. Mr. Avery wouldn't have been able to pull off such an elaborate scheme alone. He would need someone on the inside. The aftermath of the revelations about Mr. Avery had left the manor in shock. Inspector Greaves had intensified his search for the missing advisor, but even as the staff and guests clung to the idea that justice would soon be served, something felt incomplete to Tony, Sally, and Jake. They couldn't shake the feeling that something, or rather someone, had been left in the shadows. Tony and Sally couldn't help but revisit Mr. Avery's sudden disappearance. Even though Mrs. Braddock's account implicated him, the peculiar behavior of Mr. Avery, along with his cryptic note about the clock striking, nagged at them. Just as they began discussing the matter in the library, a knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. A tall, elegant woman with striking features entered, her dark hair and sharp gaze making an instant impression. She introduced herself as Miss Vivian Ashford, an old acquaintance of Lady Eliza's. Vivian explained that she had been away in Europe, but had returned upon hearing of Lady Eliza's death. She seemed genuinely distraught, but as Tony observed her, he noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, an awareness that felt too calculated for genuine grief. "We were very close," Vivian said, her voice catching. "I regret not being here sooner, but I had some urgent matters in Paris." Inspector Greaves, who had arrived shortly after Vivian's introduction, raised an eyebrow. "And when was the last time you had contact with Lady Eliza?" "Nearly a year ago," she replied. "But I spoke to her just last month through her solicitor. She had concerns regarding certain investments. Mr. Avery was handling those for her, I believe." This piqued Tony's interest. They hadn't yet considered Mr. Avery's role beyond his vague connection to Lady Eliza. But now the plot began to thicken. Had Avery been more involved in her finances than they realized? As the inspector continued questioning Vivian, Tony whispered to Sally, "There's something off about her. The way she mentions Mr. Avery, it sounds as if she knew more about him than she's letting on." Sally nodded, her gaze fixed on Vivian's poised demeanor. "I agree. I think Vivian might know more than she's revealing about Mr. Avery." Chapter 9. Tangled Webs. The following day, the mystery deepened when a servant found a letter hidden under the carpet in Lady Eliza's bedroom. The letter, scrawled hastily in Lady Eliza's own hand, mentioned Mr. Avery as a friend with questionable intentions and warned her heir to stay cautious of both shadows and sweet words. Tony, Sally, and Jake studied the letter intently, each realizing that Lady Eliza had seen through her so-called friend. Their suspicions grew, and they shared their findings with Inspector Greaves, who seemed troubled by the implication. "It appears Lady Eliza was more aware of her circumstances than we initially thought," he murmured. "This letter suggests that Mr. Avery may have been manipulating her for his own gain." As they pieced together these new clues, a shocking development unfolded. Mr. Avery, it turned out, was not who he claimed to be. He had been masquerading under various aliases, deceiving wealthy women into trusting him with their investments. The revelation sent a chill through the manor as whispers of his deceit spread among the guests. It was clear now that Mr. Avery was a practiced con artist, a man skilled in charming his way into high society to extract money from vulnerable individuals. The investment he was handling for Lady Eliza had been nothing more than a ploy to gain her trust and her fortune, and it appeared that he hadn't been working alone. "Do you think Vivian could be his accomplice?" Sally asked Inspector Greaves as they continued their investigation. The inspector considered this. "It's possible. Mr. Avery wouldn't have been able to pull off such an elaborate scheme alone. He would need someone on the inside." Chapter 10. The Accomplice Unveiled. As Inspector Greaves questioned Vivian, she began to falter under the pressure. Her stories grew inconsistent, and her once calm exterior began to crack. Finally, unable to withstand the inspector's intense questioning, she broke down and admitted that she had been working alongside Mr. Avery for years, luring wealthy individuals into Avery's scheme and collecting her share of the profits. According to her confession, she and Mr. Avery had targeted Lady Eliza because of her wealth and reclusive nature, hoping to drain her funds without attracting too much attention. However, when Lady Eliza began to grow suspicious and prepared to cut ties with Avery, the two had panicked. "We didn't mean for her to die," Vivian insisted. But Avery was desperate. He knew Lady Eliza was about to expose us, and he did something he couldn't undo. Inspector Greaves was unimpressed by her feigned remorse. "You aided him in deceiving Lady Eliza and allowed her death to happen. You're as guilty as he is." As Vivian was taken away, another revelation struck Tony. If Mrs. Braddock was supposedly a loyal servant, he mused, why would she help Mr. Avery? And why would she allow herself to be tied up if it would draw attention to her? Sally's eyes widened in understanding. She must be part of Avery's gang. The whole scene with her bound and gagged was probably just a way to deflect suspicion and give Avery more time to escape. Inspector Greaves, overhearing, nodded. "Excellent observation. I think it's time we question Mrs. Braddock again." Chapter 11. The Final Reveal. The questioning of Mrs. Braddock proved more revealing than anticipated. Under the inspector's intense gaze, her loyalty to Avery crumbled. She finally confessed that she had been in on the plan from the beginning, working alongside Avery and Vivian to manipulate Lady Eliza. When Lady Eliza grew suspicious, Mrs. Braddock had reported her every move to Avery, helping him devise ways to regain her trust. According to Mrs. Braddock, the plan had gone awry when Lady Eliza began to confide in her nephew, Jake, and sought advice from her solicitor to secure her estate. Avery, realizing his grip was slipping, had decided to poison her. Mrs. Braddock's attack had been orchestrated as a diversion, hoping to divert attention away from Avery and buy him time to escape. She admitted that the letter and vial of poison were her doing, carefully planted to make it appear as if someone else in the household had been behind the murder. Inspector Greaves sighed heavily. So Avery was the mastermind, Vivian his willing accomplice, and Mrs. Braddock the inside informant who allowed his scheme to flourish. As Mrs. Braddock was led away, Tony, Sally, and Jake felt a wave of relief. The mystery was finally over, and the web of deceit that had threatened to destroy Lady Eliza's legacy had been unraveled. Epilogue. Shadows dispelled. With the criminals apprehended, the occupants of Townsend Manor could finally breathe freely again. The village fest went ahead with somber acknowledgement of Lady Eliza's passing, but also with a renewed sense of community as the townspeople joined to celebrate her life. Inspector Greaves commended Tony and Sally for their tenacity and insight, noting that without their intervention, Avery's scheme might never have been uncovered. Jake expressed his gratitude to his friends, grateful not only for their help, but for their unwavering friendship. As the festivities drew to a close, Tony and Sally took one last look around Townsend Manor, reflecting on the dark secrets that had come to light. "Do you think Lady Eliza knew she was in danger?" Sally asked quietly. "I think she suspected it," Tony replied, "and she tried to protect herself the best she could. She left us enough clues to ensure the truth would be revealed." As they walked down the cobbled path away from Townsend Manor, they knew that although shadows would always linger in certain corners of the world, the light of truth had triumphed once again, thanks to their persistence, courage, and keen intuition.